Hey guys, so I let's start now. So, Hi, my name is Arav Mathur, and I'm a grade 7 student studying at Captain R. Wilson Public School in Oakville, Ontario. So, welcome to SparkPro webinar series. As we all know, the coronavirus is disrupting our daily lives, but I also think that this is a great opportunity for us kids to learn beyond our normal school curriculum. So I've started this webinar series called SparkPro to spark ideas in children by learning from professionals in different careers. So this is my first SparkPro webinar and I hope you enjoy it. Our speaker for today is Michelle Anagnostou. She, she is a conservation scientist who has dedicated her career to studying and protecting wildlife. She is currently working towards her Ph.D. and is researching she's researching poaching and international wildlife trade. In this webinar, Michelle will introduce us to her career path, what it takes to be a conservationist, as well as uh, the some of the biggest causes, consequences, and solutions to global species extinction. But before we start, let's set up a few ground rules. We will be recording this webinar, so feel free to turn off your video if you don't want to be recorded. Please keep your microphones on mute at all times unless you're asking a question. We will have question and answer session towards the end of the webinar. And if you have any questions, you can type it in the comments or you can use the raise hand button and we will let you know when to ask the question. If you're on a desktop or computer, you can see in the comments section that there is also a raise hand option on your name and the participants window. If you're on a mobile, you can click the participants icon on the top right corner and you will see both the options written. Also, without further ado, let's welcome Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, for volunteering to be SparkPro's first speaker. We're very excited to hear from you, and also thanks to everyone joining us today, and hope you get to learn something new. Over to you, Michelle.
Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for welcoming me as the first speaker of the SparkPro webinar series. And thank you so much to Arav for inviting me and for hosting it. Today I'm going to be giving you all a bit of a crash course on careers in conservation, which I hope might inspire you, some of you at least, to consider it as a possible option, because I know it's not the most obvious choice and most people don't think of it as the most common or conventional career. So first, I'll just outline a bit about some of the things I wanted to discuss. So I'll give you a brief overview of my personal career path to becoming a conservationist, some of the key concepts that you need to understand in order to understand the importance of a career in conservation, some of the challenges to wildlife around the world, my specific area of research, which is poaching and wildlife trafficking. So just as a little disclaimer, I am going to be talking about poaching, which I realize can be a bit upsetting. And then some of the typical careers in conservation and how to succeed in the field. I'll give some general tips and advice that hopefully some of you might find useful, and I'm happy to answer questions at the end. So a bit about me. Like Arav said, I am a PhD student. I'm currently at the University of Waterloo, and I am a conservation and wildlife crime researcher. I previously studied first at the University of Toronto to get my degree in ecology and evolutionary biology. And then I moved to the UK for a year and I studied at the University of Kent. And that's where I specialized in conservation and the international wildlife trade. So as a young child growing up in Ontario, I spent my summers outdoors, doing everything, swimming, hiking, camping, and just trying to experience nature firsthand. And some of my fondest memories were when, the park rangers would come around to a campsite and would gather up all of the campers for presentations on the local wildlife. And I was just absolutely fascinated. So little did I know that not so many years later, I would have a group of children of my own surrounding me and asking me questions about wildlife as well. So just a few weeks after my 16th birthday, literally as soon as I was old enough to volunteer, I was accepted into my first official role to help animals at a local animal hospital. And this was part of a co-op placement or cooperative education placement at my high school. And it was at that young age that I confirmed without a doubt that I wanted to dedicate my life to protecting animals and the world's biodiversity. Sorry, I'm just trying to figure it out.
Hey, Michelle?
Mm-hmm.
I think some of us can't hear you. Just confirming with everyone, can you all hear her?
Yes, Arav, we are able to hear.
Yes, we are able to hear as well.
Great, thanks for confirming.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Great. So my first summer after high school, I spent it in Algonquin Provincial Park, and I was volunteering with the research teams at the Algonquin Wildlife Research Station. And so my job there was to find snapping turtles and painted turtles, and we would tag them like you can see in this picture on the left, and track them and collect data when we found them. So yes, that's right. It's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, we spent all day canoeing around a beautiful national park looking for wildlife. And it was an amazing experience. And, you could hear wolves howling at night. And this just, for me, told me that I was on the right track. So next up, the following summer, I went further up north in Ontario to a wildlife rehabilitation center. Now, what wildlife rehabilitation means is that animals that are injured or orphaned are brought to us, and then we provide animal care and hopefully bring them back to health so they can be released back into the wild. So this means preparing food and fluids and medicine and wound care, and making sure that the animals are ready to go back to their natural habitats. So this means everything from pretty much all Ontario wildlife that you can think of. Moose, snakes, snowy owls, coyotes, foxes, skunks, raccoons, songbirds, etc. So my personal favorite were the beaver kits, like in this picture here. They require plenty of extra care and attention and companionship. And so I really enjoyed looking after them. My experiences have also led me to dissecting humpback whales in Nova Scotia as part of a marine biology internship, and in Greece as well. So I did a small project on recording the behaviors of bottlenose dolphins in Greece as part of the Ionian Dolphin Project, and that was another amazing experience. I then spent 3 summers in the jungles of Costa Rica right before starting my master's. So my role there was the title of Assistant Research Officer. So I led groups of volunteers on trails, and I supervised their activities to ensure good data collection for sea turtles and vegetation and big cats and reptiles, amphibians, and birds as well. And specifically, I actually led the primate research project. So there are 4 species of primates there. This includes spider monkeys, capuchin monkeys, squirrel monkeys and howler monkeys, which get their name because they have a booming voice and you can actually hear them from up to 3 miles away. They're the loudest monkey, and that sound will wake you up in the morning, let me tell you. So that was another amazing experience, although I would not recommend it if you are afraid of creepy crawlers, because in the jungles of the tropics, there are a lot of them. Everything from big spiders to scorpions to snakes. So for several consecutive summers, I've worked in the field studying wildlife and ecosystems. And these experiences solidified my decision to dedicate my life to studying and protecting wildlife, not only for my generation, but also for future generations to come. Then, as part of more of my formal education, like I mentioned before, I went to England to study at the University of Kent, where I focused on learning about wildlife crime and wildlife trade. And it was there that I met loads of amazing people, and I made the connections that allowed me to do a research project in Uganda. So now this is where I'll introduce you to the concept of wildlife crime. So this is essentially any activities that relate to wildlife that go against laws and legislation. So common examples of this are illegal hunting, or what is commonly referred to as poaching, or the illegal trading of wildlife. So this sounds pretty bad, right? I mean, who would do that? I love animals, right? And so a lot of people think that this must mean that poachers are bad people. And this is a very common perspective, but I'd like to offer you a new one. So let's imagine for a second that you didn't grow up here. And imagine you live in a big, beautiful national park, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa. Your family are farmers, and your entire livelihood depends on having a good harvest. Now, one day, an elephant comes in the middle of the night and tramples on all of your crops, and they are all destroyed, the ones that you have spent the last 6 or 8 months growing and cultivating. Now, maybe the next week a leopard comes and it eats your livestock and your goats, or even attacks a fellow villager. Many of us, if not all of us, would be really upset in this scenario. Now imagine that the money from killing and selling one animal might offer you enough funds to not only put food on the table, but your parents can now afford to actually put you in school in hopes of offering you a better life. So maybe it's not so black and white, right? And this is why I really wanted to emphasize that we cannot do... sorry, are some people still not able to hear me?
I think it's only one person. It's Tony Yin.
Okay.
So okay, yeah.
Okay, I'll continue. So right, this is why I really wanted to emphasize that we cannot do conservation. We can't protect wildlife unless we're listening to the voices of the local people who live with the wildlife. And it is essential to understand those perspectives and their viewpoints. And this goes no matter where you're working in the world. So now on to some broader concepts. So conservation science, or conservation biology, is the field that seeks to study and protect the living world and all of its biological diversity. And conservationists use this term, biodiversity, to encompass the complete range of species and biological communities, as well as the genetic variation within species and all of the ecosystem processes. So this can be thought of on three basic levels. First, you have species diversity. So this is all species on Earth, including single-celled bacteria and protists, as well as the species of the multicellular kingdoms, fungi, plants, and animals. And about 1.5 million species have been identified to date, but most of these do belong to invertebrates, and especially insects in particular. Then you have another level, which is genetic diversity. I won't go into that too much, but basically that includes the genetic diversity within species, both between populations in different areas and within individuals of the same population. And then the third level is ecosystem diversity. So these are different biological communities and how they associate with their chemical and physical environment. So the biological communities that are found in deserts and wetlands and grasslands and forests, all of these support the continuity of proper ecosystem functioning. And these ecosystem functionings are what provide central services to people. So this can include clean water, filtering the air that we breathe, irrigation, medicine, foods, protection from soil erosion and flooding, and there's many other examples of these types of services. So we rely on healthy ecosystems too. So what are the challenges to conserving species? We currently live in a time when the world's biodiversity is in rapid decline. And not only that, but this is the greatest rate of extinction that the world has seen in the past million years. Some species are going extinct before scientists even have been able to discover them and describe them scientifically. So this is not the first time this is happening. In Earth's history, we have had 5 previous episodes of mass extinctions, according to the fossil records. The most famous of which you guys will probably be familiar with, which is the extinction of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago in the Cretaceous period. And after that time, that's when mammals started to become the dominant group on terrestrial or land environments. Now, the current mass extinction, often referred to as the 6th mass extinction, is because of, drumroll, human activity. It's not that shocking. Since humans came onto the scene, we kind of have a tendency to act a bit selfishly as a species. Let's say we can be a bit myopic or nearsighted. And so since humans came onto the scene tens of thousands of years ago, we started hunting species to extinction on all continents. And even in prehistoric times, researchers have found extensive evidence of human destruction and overexploitation of habitats that coincide with high rates of species extinctions. And our population has only increased exponentially. So more recently, since the 17th, 18th centuries, over 200 species of just birds and mammals have gone extinct. And species are considered rare and especially vulnerable to extinction if it lives in a narrow geographic range, like an island, for example. It occupies only one or few specialized habitats, like alpine species, or a really specialized niche, like panda bears that just eat bamboo. Or if it has only one or a few populations, if these are really small. So an example of that could be Asiatic lions or Amur leopards, for example. And of course, species that are overly hunted or harvested by people. Good example of this is rhinos. So this has led to people using the term Anthropocene when describing this area of biodiversity. And anthro meaning human. So some people define this as starting from the Industrial Revolution, like this graph shows here. The correlation between industrial development, human population, and species extinctions. And this is why some people have referred to us as the super predators of the Anthropocene. So this does not necessarily refer to predator in the meat-eating sense, but more so that we evolved ecologically and culturally to have the capacity to be the top predators. So some of the biggest threats to biodiversity include habitat destruction, like, for example, clear-cutting rainforests, habitat fragmentation, like building a highway through a forest, habitat degradation, like pollution, global climate change, of course, a lot of us will be familiar with this now. So these images here show the phenomenon of coral reef habitat degradation called coral reef bleaching. And this is a result of warming ocean temperatures and carbon pollution, as well as, of course, the overexploitation of species for our purposes, as well as the spread of exotic species and diseases. So now on to my specific area of focus, which is wildlife crime. So again, this means poaching, this means illegal wildlife trade and trafficking of species. So some of our planet's most iconic endangered animals are being poached to be illegally traded for a variety of purposes: meat and seafood production, as exotic pets, traded for supplying zoos, for traditional medicines, art and decor, clothing, jewelry, and even furniture. And a lot of people are going to be more aware of this now in the context of this global pandemic, where the news has been putting a lot of media attention on wildlife trade and wildlife meat consumption. However, it still struggles to capture the political attention that I think it deserves, because it's often seen as a victimless crime. So first, I'll introduce you to this animal here. A lot of people don't even know it existed. You may not have seen it before or heard of it. It is called the pangolin. So there are 8 species of pangolin, 4 in Africa, 4 in Asia, and it is the #1 most trafficked animal on the planet. So they're highly sought after for what you see in the image here, which are those scales at the top of their body. And these are just made of keratin, which is the same substance as our hair and our fingernails. But it's thought to hold medicinal properties that in some cultures is believed to cure everything from hangover to cancer. So just in Hong Kong and Singapore alone, just in 2019, they seized well over $100 million worth of pangolin scales. Probably the more obvious example when we think of poaching and wildlife trafficking is rhinos. So rhinos are often poached just for their horns, which can fetch up to $65,000 on the black market, which makes it more than its weight in gold. And their populations have declined dramatically in recent decades, and one is poached roughly every 8 to 12 hours. This is an example that's closer to home for us. This bird here is called the gyrfalcon, and they're native to Canada, and they are highly popular in the falconry trade, so live bird trade, and they can fetch upwards of $200,000 per one bird. So you can see that the wildlife trade is highly lucrative. Another obvious example that most of us think of is elephants. And elephants in particular are usually hunted for their tusks. And more than 35,000 elephants are killed each year so that their tusks can be carved into ivory trinkets, like this image here shows, or also jewelry and bracelets and things like that from ivory. Another common example is pets that are traded for the pet trade. wildlife that is traded for the pet trade. Popular ones are tropical birds and turtles and reptiles. Don't actually worry about this little guy here. I took these pictures. This is just an example, but this one was released into the wild and it's doing fine. Animals are also traded for furniture and decor, like I said, as well as clothing and accessories and jewelry. This here would be a tiger claw necklace. And really interesting is a new trend that we're seeing where with global warming and the permafrost melting in Russia, people are actually excavating extinct animals like tusks and rhino horns from woolly mammoths and woolly rhinoceros. So these items here wouldn't have seen daylight for the past 11,000 years. So there's a lot of negative effects. I won't dwell on this, but it's just important to note that they're complex and it affects not only the decline of endangered species, but also people who live with the wildlife, and so human welfare concerns, human security and habitat destruction, and public health concerns with the spread of viruses. And in recent years, we've seen a trend that this trade is increasingly profiting highly organized criminal groups and less so just the ad hoc poacher. So some of where we've kind of been coming short to date is that park rangers are often given military weapons and told to treat poachers as the enemy. So what this does is it can harm local people, like I said, who may be living in poverty, and it kind of targets the wrong actors versus focusing on the higher up criminals. So we definitely need a better approach, and lots of research still needs to be done to figure this out because we have a lot of unknowns. Skip over that. So how do we solve this? Well, I know a lot of what I said is a bit doom and gloom, but I think it's important to understand these issues that are driving species extinctions and to spread awareness because that actually helps conservation efforts. And it's also important to note that I'm actually really optimistic about what we can achieve. So knowing how urgent this issue is what motivates me to do what I do, and it's why conservation is really a passion-driven career. So because of the many dimensions of wildlife trade, first and foremost, we need to apply a transdisciplinary approach that combines natural, political, and social sciences, and these are essential to mitigate wildlife crime. So this is why I have a hard time kind of picking one category to define myself in, because I would call myself a wildlife scientist, but also a social scientist, criminologist, and many different disciplines that I combine into my research. So tackling the international wildlife trade must become a priority, not only for the sake of protecting wildlife that is subject to often cruel conditions, but also for promoting long-term economic sustainability. And people are starting to chat about this now, like I mentioned, in the current context. And I think this in itself is a reason to be optimistic about future changes. I'm just seeing somebody is raising their hand. Is that for a question?
Yeah, I think we can take the questions later on, or
Okay, so hang on to your question and we can answer it at the end. Don't forget it. I have a few more things that I'd like to say first. So I also think that another important consideration is that because this is such a global issue, we need solutions that are global in scope. And one way to do this is by increasing cooperation. So conservation and wildlife managers need to work with law enforcement, who need to work with policymakers and politicians and local communities. And all of these levels need to work together to achieve our common goal. And future efforts will also need people who are committed to making a difference, that are directly involved in educating and empowering people about conservation issues. And new approaches to conservation are striving to bridge this gap and tackle conservation conflicts by enhancing community engagement in biodiversity protection to promote a peaceful coexistence. So, now what I do is obsess over this big, complicated international issue with dimensions to organized crime. I am not exactly a typical conservationist, and the issue that I chose to tackle is quite intense, but not all of us do that. In fact, there are tons of possible jobs and opportunities that you can pursue, the one that interests you most and is best suited towards your skill sets. So just remember, for example, some of my previous work experiences. So I've listed a few of them here, but there are many more. A common example might be a wildlife biologist. So this is somebody who gathers, analyzes, and interprets data on wildlife and habitats, including everything from behavior, population dynamics, genetics, disease, nutrition, land use changes, and all of this is to conserve the species and improve habitat conditions. Then you have wildlife managers, and so these are the people in charge of decision making of the best way to manage and maintain a wild area or wild populations, and human use to produce the best benefits for wildlife and the general public. Another common career might be a wildlife educator, who could teach in high school or university, or in, for example, what I did, I also volunteered in a museum, and teaching the public about wildlife science and conservation, or doing this through outreach initiatives. There's also a wildlife law enforcement officer, or what might be called a ranger, who enforces the wildlife laws and regulations, like anti-poaching, and often performs surveys of wildlife populations as well, and are involved in things like trapping and collaring wild animals to study them. They respond to complaints of nuisance wildlife, and also educate the public about wildlife issues. If that doesn't interest you, you can be a consultant for big business and inform them how to make their corporate practices more sustainable and biodiversity friendly. If you're a bit of a technological whiz, we need people like that. So people who are inventive or have an entrepreneurial mind can try your hand at this too. Conservation is crying out for people with coding knowledge and IT experts, and people who can come up with these types of novel solutions to difficult problems. There are conservation scientists who manage the quality of lakes and natural resources, who work with landowners at all levels of government to devise ways to improve land use planning while safeguarding the environment. There are people who collect data on trees and soil quality and assess damage after fires and logging activity. And there's so many more. There's veterinary medicine, so people who have veterinary degrees can specialize in wildlife and work in a zoo or in the field setting. So there's many options. So a bit on how to succeed in this field. Get a good grounding on life sciences, I think, is important, such as biology and ecology, physical scientists. So in high school, which some of you will be starting soon, this means that important subjects will be things like biology, math, English is actually really important, chemistry, and computer science as well, like I mentioned. So I think you should also explore courses in social sciences if you have the opportunity, such as the humanities and economics and things pertaining to government, and get experience working with computers, as well as get some volunteering experience if you can. So like I said, this is what really helped me get an idea of what these different jobs entail, was volunteering at a young age. And if you have an environmental club at your school, you should also join that. These are some of the general traits that I think are important to have for a career in conservation. And I think it's important to be somebody who likes to work outdoors, and maybe as well somebody who likes to travel, because this job can take you to many different places around the world. You also have to be passionate about learning about the natural world. So a good indication of this is maybe if you like watching National Geographic documentaries on TV. It's also important to be a problem solver who likes coming up with innovative solutions, enjoy the sciences, and you must be able to communicate with people from all walks of life. And that one is really important. But it's really rewarding as well, because you get to meet some of the most amazing people when you travel to different places to study wildlife. So if you're really proactive and you like to plan 2 steps ahead, most jobs will also require at least one higher education degree for most conservation jobs. So schools actually rarely offer a program that's just called conservation. So these are a list of all the other ones that I could think of that you might also have to consider applying to. It's like I mentioned, I did mine in ecology and evolutionary biology. But it could be zoology, it could be called natural resource management, environmental science, agriculture, sustainable development, even things like biogeography, fisheries management. There's many examples, and you'll just have to look in the future at whatever university you're interested in applying to and see what courses they offer and programs. So this list isn't completely comprehensive. So where do we work? Typically, a lot of conservationists will have office work and field work. So when I say field work, I just mean being outdoors and doing things like observing wildlife or interviewing local communities. But there's also the desk-based side of it, where you have to research papers and find out what the best practices are and how this applies to your work. And you yourself will often have to prepare reports and scientific articles and communicate with stakeholders. So this means having meetings with all of these people that I've mentioned, people from government or communities or scientists and colleagues. And in some cases, there's also lab work. If you're doing, for example, something relating to understanding toxicology of an aquatic ecosystem, you might have to take a sample and then do some chemical work in a lab, or a genetic sample from hair collected from bears, for example. These are all different examples of what you can do in the lab, but usually these are your 3 options for where you might end up, and usually it's a combination. So that's all that I had prepared, but thank you so much for listening, and happy to take questions because I know I covered a lot of ground. So if you guys have questions now, I'll be happy to take a look and see if I can answer them for you.
Okay, so I can see that Muskan Sharma has raised her hand. Can you please unmute and ask your question?
Put it in the chat.
So Muskan's question is, she has a few questions. So, first, her question is, where do animals come from, Michelle?
Okay, so I'll start with that one.
Yeah.
So this goes back to the concept of evolution. And this is something that you might not learn about, I think, until the university level. But essentially, it's this idea that we all started from a single-celled organism millions and millions of years ago, and that over time, it has species change into different types of species because a trait might be found advantageous, and then that allows an organism to explore a new environment, and then that is sort of replicated over time. This is a really complicated concept, but it started with fish that turned into terrestrial mammals. So that's how we got amphibians, and then reptiles, and also mammals. And then we've only, throughout millions and millions of years, this process kept going and going, and now we have these 1.5 million species that I talked about. So again, it's a really complicated topic of evolution, but that's sort of it in a nutshell. And it'll make a lot more sense if in high school you take a biology class and you learn a bit about genetics. That's definitely going to help. So if you're interested in that, that's what I would definitely recommend. It's a good question, though. It's a tough one to answer.
So, Michelle, her next question is, what does poaching have to do with us humans? Normally, people would only listen if it affects their life. So, how does it affect us?
That's also a really good question. And the answer is a bit multifold, actually. So first, there's a concept I'll introduce you to. It's called ecosystem services, which is basically the services that humans derive from wildlife and biodiversity. So an example of this is that a mangrove forest protects its local communities from flooding, or the fact that we can get medicinal plants from trees. And all of this is thought of to put a value on nature. Because with that in mind, right, a lot of people don't care about things unless it pertains to them. The conservationists have come up with this idea that if we assign economic value to each of these services, then people will care. So if we say that keeping our forests intact allows us to breathe clean air, then this is worth probably trillions of dollars a year. And promoting this sort of argument is helpful to get people who otherwise wouldn't care about wildlife to take an interest by assigning an economic value. And so this also relates to poaching, because a lot of people who live near wildlife might depend on it for ecotourism. Maybe they are a park guide and they lead people through these beautiful areas, and then that's how they get their income. Or maybe they rely on the animal for subsistence purposes, so things like eating it, or also just regulating ecosystem dynamics. I think you guys might be familiar with already. So, things about trophic levels and how we need the top predators to keep the herbivores intact so that they don't overgraze the grass and vegetation. And it's very intertwined. And so these concepts are really important when trying to understand why people should care about poaching. It's that it's not just the animal being poached that's being affected, but it's also all of these other species and ecosystem dynamics that are affected. And if we want our children and our grandchildren to be able to live in a world that has elephants, then as the international community needs to take an interest in stopping poaching.
Okay, thank you. A few more questions here. So, your third question is, how do you work during quarantine? How is your work going on right now?
That's also a really good question. For me, I am quite lucky because I am currently doing the desk-based part of my research project. So like I mentioned, sometimes you're in the field, sometimes you're at the office. So right now, I am just working from home. I'm on my computer and doing the planning stage for going into the field, hopefully next year. And also, like I mentioned, there's a lot of data analysis that has to be done and writing up reports. So that might sound a bit boring, but I think it's quite exciting to be able to take what I've learned from my experiences and write it so that I can communicate it to other people who are outside of my conservation world.
Michelle?
Mm-hmm.
So can you share this presentation with all of us? Can you just send the presentation to me so I can share it to everybody?
Sure, that's not a problem at all. Happy to do that.
Thanks. So our next question is, what if somebody is allergic to fur, pollen, or grass? Can they still go take this part in this career?
Right. Yes, I would say definitely. It just, because there's so much diversity in this career path, that you can find a way to make it work that works for you, where you're not putting yourself in harm. So whether you're working, maybe you design your research projects so they don't happen during the time of year when pollen is at its peak, or maybe you're doing less stuff actually in forests and in fields, but more with, like I mentioned, the community side of it, which is still really important. Or you could be entirely lab-based or entirely computer-based, but there's definitely lots of options, and I don't think you should let allergies hold you back. Okay.
So our next question is, what exactly does IT and technology have to work with this? Because this is usually field work.
Yeah, so that's a really good question. A lot of computer technology is starting to be applied to the field of conservation. And there's so many different ways that this can be done. In particular for, again, my focus, which is anti-poaching, there's people who code or write algorithms so that we can detect animals that are being sold on social media. So for example, it's like a computer bot that basically goes around and searches through the internet. And if it sees that it can detect an image of, let's say, a great ape or an elephant tusk or a tiger cub that is being sold on social media, and then it can report that to the authorities. So then the authorities are able to do their job a lot more efficiently. And this is also done when it comes to at the border. So allowing, just deciding what to allow through and being able to screen suitcases and shipping containers and things like that. And there's many applications, but you have to get a bit creative. But there's definitely a demand for that in the field of conservation.
Our next question is, how do you find the projects to do?
So this is where the dedication and passion comes in handy. Some projects can be a bit tricky to find what exactly is going on, but every time I look for a new project, I just search for it online. If I think that maybe I'd like to try some marine research, I search that, and then I find different research groups or research institutes, NGOs, things like that, and I just contact them. And I send them emails and see if there's any opportunities in case there's something that's not being advertised. And I think that's a great way to do it, is just to be, take some initiative and inquire about your interests. And most people will be happy to hear from a young conservationist that shares their interests. And I think you might get some positive responses, but also you can't be discouraged if people don't respond to you, because that happened to me a lot, trust me. Oftentimes people are just so busy and your email might get buried. So don't take that personally. It does happen, but it's definitely worth the try, in my opinion, because you can end up with some of the volunteering experiences that I've had.
So, how many mammals have we discovered till now in the world?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not entirely sure the number off the top of my head. I can actually find it right now, though, for you. So one thing to note, though, is that mammals is actually, I think when we try and classify, humans are a bit obsessed with putting things into categories. So even defining what a species is can be a bit arbitrary. So for example, we have giraffes, and then you have subspecies of giraffes, like the Maasai giraffe or the reticulated giraffe. And this goes for most species. You have the species and then the subspecies, and then there's actually a lot of debate on how you define a species in the field. That's sort of a thing that it's a bit nuanced, but researchers like to argue about things. So according to Google, there are 5,416 different species of mammals, to answer your question. But that number does change all the time as we learn more about what a species is, and we discover more species, and we find that something might not, in fact, be as closely related. And all of this relates to evolution and genetics, which is a bit complicated.
Okay, so our next question is, do you study land or do you study marine mammals?
So this can come to personal preference. A lot of people are really interested in sharks or whales or whatever, and then they can choose to focus on marine ecosystems. Me personally, I'm kind of looking at wildlife trade broadly speaking. So this can be both terrestrial and marine, because there is a lot of trade of marine species too, things like sharks for shark fin soup. So I think it's important to look at both types of ecosystems. But if you're deciding which one to focus on, I would just go with whatever you're most interested in, because there's definitely a need for both aquatic or specifically marine or terrestrial, and there's a need for conservation at all of these levels. So all of them are equally important.
Okay, our next question is, how does tagging turtles help you as your job as a conservationist?
Right. So when I did the turtle project, we were trying to understand snapping turtles, which are really long-lived animals. So they're kind of like elephants, like they can live, well, we actually don't have the precise answer because they haven't been studied. But so this type of project where you're tagging turtles, we were doing it every year so that we could know which individuals are which and keep track of them. So, for example, you can tag a turtle with, let's say, the number 15, And then every year when you find turtle 15, you can record how big it's gotten and where it is. And then that way you can monitor their movements, where they might be relocating, which is important for land use management and decision making. And you can also try and keep track of how old they are and how they relate to different ecosystems. So that was sort of the goal with the turtle tagging project. But a lot of animals are tagged in different ways. So a lot of mammals might be have a collar put on them with a radio transmitter, and birds get a band around their little legs. And so there's lots of different techniques that we can use to identify individuals, and this allows for long-term monitoring.
Okay, thank you. So, do you protect animals who get hurt and are orphans?
Yeah, so that's the type of wildlife work that's called wildlife rehabilitation, or working at a wildlife refuge center. So this is like when, let's say, an animal gets hit by a car and then it's hurt, and then people bring it to the center, and then that's where they have animal care professionals that can take care of it and protect it. And the same goes for if somebody finds baby birds or any kind of orphaned animal that needs care and protection, that's where they go to be taken care of. So, this can also be called a wildlife sanctuary in some cases. And so that's kind of that work. That's not what I'm doing specifically anymore, because I kind of moved away from animal care and more into research. But it's definitely a very rewarding job. I really enjoyed doing that kind of hands-on thing. If you like working hands-on with animals, then that could be the job for you.
Okay. So, there's another question about how many species go extinct every decade. Just like a rough answer.
This depends on how we do as conservationists. So the United Nations declared the past decade as the UN Decade on Biodiversity. The main goal of which being to stop this crazy rate of extinction that we were seeing. And so a lot of efforts are being put into slowing the extinction rate, and it actually has slowed. So I think that's a reason to be optimistic. But the number changes every year based on different kinds of conditions and stresses, and how we do with climate change and how we mitigate the effects of climate change will also be a big determinant of species extinction rates. And on that note, I'd also like to mention that while conservation, you can deal with sometimes things that are a bit sad to think about. And because of this reason, people started a movement called conservation optimism, which might be worth looking into if you're interested in. And this is a way to celebrate the success stories. So it's not all bad news. There's a lot that we have to pat ourselves on the back for. And sometimes populations can bounce back from low numbers and almost near extinction. And so, there's a lot of optimism that can go around.
Thanks. So, what do the animal law enforcement have to do in their job? What does the animal law enforcement have to do?
So there's different levels of this, but probably the most obvious one might be people who are law enforcement officers in a protected area. So they would patrol around and make sure that people aren't conducting any illegal activities within the protected area. So, and when I say protected area, I mean national parks, provincial parks, game reserves, things like that. So these people ensure that the law is being upheld in natural areas. So, they require extra skill sets that is different from police because they need to know all about the local wildlife and wildlife biology and what to do when you see wildlife and how to protect people from wildlife instances. So, like I mentioned, let's say a tiger or a leopard or cheetah or a bear or whatever goes into a community. And so these are the people that are going to be called to protect the community and to maybe dart the animal and take it back into its natural habitat so that neither the animal or any people get hurt. So that's another role of a law enforcement officer.
Thanks. Oh, and how does the COVID-19 virus affect the law enforcement, animal law enforcement?
That's such a good question. We're still seeing a bit how it plays out because, it's still a bit early stages and there's a lot of effects that are going to be unknown. But I think that because tourism basically stopped in a lot of places, and tourism is the main source of funding for law enforcement in a lot of areas. So this could actually be a negative effect on law enforcement because they aren't getting this sort of external revenue that they use to do their anti-poaching patrols. So this might mean an increase in poaching, especially because law enforcement are also being directed more towards pandemic-specific roles and needs, which is understandable. And also local communities who have just had maybe been laid off from work and they have no source of income. We're quite lucky here in Canada with the benefits that we're being offered from the government, but not every country does that. And then those people might have to turn to poaching as a source of income. So there's a couple different possible effects, but again, at this stage, we're sort of just guessing and making predictions, but we have yet to see exactly how it's going to play out.
Okay. So, are animals actually dying because of this virus?
Well, there have been a few reported cases in big cats. I think the last I read, we're still studying it, and again, there's a lot we don't know. I think animals can carry it for sure because that's how it was initially transmitted to humans. So we know possible carriers can be dogs, cat species, bats, and pangolins, just for example. But it's probably not as damaging in certain animals as it is actually to humans. But again, there's still lots of research and papers are being published about this every day, so there's still a lot to learn.
Okay. So another question is, which organization do you work with?
So at the moment, I'm actually a student. So this means that I'm based at a university. So my organization that I'm most affiliated with would be the University of Waterloo. But after I graduate, I'm still an early career conservationist. So after I graduate, I have the same options that I basically listed before. I could go work for the government. I could stay in the university setting and become a professor who teaches about conservation, or work for an NGO. There are small local NGOs. There's big international ones like WWF, you've probably heard of. And there's still a lot of options. But at the moment, my organization would be the university.
Okay. So, have you ever seen an endangered species?
I have, yeah, I'm quite lucky. So actually a lot of the pictures that I used in this presentation were from my last few trips. So I've seen some endangered species like rhinos and elephants, which are some of the ones I was talking about, which is an amazing experience. And I enjoy it. And that just motivates me even more to do the work that I do to protect them.
Thank you. So, a question is, have you ever seen a cheetah run in its fastest speed?
Oh, I would love to. I have seen a few cheetahs, but they were just lounging around because it was the middle of the day and it was hot and they were just being lazy. So I kind of missed out there, but maybe next time.
How do common people or us know about uh, conservation and wildlife laws? And do we need more awareness about this?
I think we definitely have a big way to go when it comes to educating and general awareness for the public, because that's why wildlife is in such high demand anyway, is often because the people who are buying it might not be aware of the serious consequences that it's having. So, for example, oh, and I see here, sorry, that the question says wildlife laws. That's actually really important. And I was just writing about that because oftentimes at the community level, people may have not even been aware that what they were doing is a crime. And so that's another reason why we should be hesitant to use these heavily militarized approaches, because if people aren't even aware of the law, I don't think that's exactly fair. And we need more awareness at all levels, from stopping people in Canada from consuming, or stopping people from at the poaching level, or transiting, and there's lots that needs to be done, especially even if you guys are on social media. Sometimes I'm just scrolling through and you can see somebody with an exotic pet and they're showing it off like, ooh, look at this fancy exotic pet that I have, and they might not be realizing this whole industry that they're contributing to and how awful it is. So I think maybe we need, I don't know, some more documentaries and some more public service announcements, and maybe teaching it in school. So I think we could do a lot of improvements there.
Thanks. Do you think that because people are inside a lot, animals are less likely to go extinct now?
This could be true. A lot of people have been reporting increased sights of wildlife now with human traffic going down, so less cars on the road and less people walking around in urban areas, and also decreased pollution. So there are some reports that this means that fish are returning to areas that they were previously pushed away from because of overfishing and boat traffic, and that wildlife is increasing their numbers because of less road mortality and human activity. So this could be true. There's definitely lots of stories going around that are saying that this is what's happening. I think that it's really situation dependent, and whether or not this holds up in the long run is the key question, because if we go straight back to our old practices, then we're still going to go back to the same negative effect on wildlife. But if we'd like to promote this increasing populations, then we need to critically think about our relationship with wildlife and how we can decrease our activities so that we cause less harm in the long run.
Thank you. So we have a little less time, so let's just do these last few questions, and we'll end the session. So the first one is: if you didn't be a conservation scientist, then what would be your secondary career choice?
So the one thing, actually there's two that I seriously considered. One is becoming a vet, because I knew I loved animals, and I didn't know that conservation scientist was a career because I didn't have this webinar. And I thought that being a vet was the only way that I could work with animals. And then once I got that first volunteering job in the park, and I realized, oh my gosh, this is so amazing, and people actually do this for a living. And then that's when I switched gears and really started to focus on ecology and things like that. And the other option would be something relating to history, just because I also love learning about world history and cultures.
Thank you. So, what if you were just something that makes it more fun? Many kids would help if they weren't recorded in documentaries.
Okay, so that's actually a really good point, because we do need to make conservation more engaging. And a lot of people might hear those stories about polar ice caps melting and species are declining and just shut it out. And, nobody wants to think about that. It's a bit depressing, isn't it? So that's actually a really good point that you raise, is that we do need to make it more fun and engaging. And I don't have all the answers for how to do that. I think maybe if we start incorporating it into school curriculum, in the threats that the environment faces and the solutions to how we can help and protect biodiversity, then that's one way to do it, although school curriculum is not usually considered fun, but open to suggestions.
Are stories true about animals coming out in cities for a project? Are stories true about animals coming out in the cities when humans are inside true?
I have seen quite a few of these stories from different parts of the world, and I think there is some truth to them. And it makes sense, because if there is less noise pollution and there's less cars and just less busyness that normally scare animals away, it makes sense that they would be more open and less scared to come into these areas. And it's kind of nice to see. And what I think it shows is that, the human population is not the problem. It's just that we need more effective solutions so that we don't have this effect always, but that we can have a peaceful coexistence where our presence isn't deterring all animals from expanding out their habitats.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for your cooperation. So we will be ending the webinar here. So thanks everyone for coming, and I hope you got to learn something new and had fun. We will also be having more events like these in the future, and our next event would probably be on 23rd May, and I'll send the detailed invite to you. Also, special thanks to Michelle Anagnostou for volunteering to be SparkPro's first speaker. And special thanks to you for being such a great audience, and wish you all a wonderful weekend. And see you on the next SparkPro webinar. Until then, stay safe and stay healthy. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.
Bye.
So I just want to say it out loud for thank you for setting it up and doing all the important and interesting information.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of your interest.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.